Wow, so on cue. All I have to do is step up to the podium and everyone's in the full listening mode. We have a jam-packed event today, so I want to kick us off officially and welcome our friends who are joining us on a live stream as well. My name is Garrick Ng. I am a tall-ish Asian middle-aged male wearing a blue blazer. I had a program here at UHN called KITE Creates, and our mission is to bring together innovators and creators from both the creative industry and the health research and venture worlds and make magic, find interesting and novel ways to transform healthcare. So this is part of an event series that's been made possible by FedDev Southern Ontario, the City of Toronto. I want to thank our sponsors for being able to open the doors free of charge for a slew of events that have covered various topics that include everything from the intersection of gaming and how gaming can be a tool to engage the public on public health issues, or a vehicle for delivering therapy or home-based kind of rehabilitation in innovative and engaging ways. We've covered, I think I see some of our past speakers here, not to point a finger, Crystal, at the world of user-centered design, right? And how taking a user-centric approach to looking at everything from how we design our data and diagnostic systems to inform clinicians, or in the sense of our, or in the case of our friend Crystal, compassion and empathy kind of first ways at developing personal care plans. We've also run an amazing series that spotlighted the intersection of apparel and technology. So all the kind of cross-sector innovation that's happening that's supporting wearables and challenging the ways that we come up with designs and tailored to the needs and dimensions of diverse users. What else have we done? Oh, we've done a partnered event with the VR/AR Association of Canada, spotlighting the amazing implementation of virtual VR-assisted surgical training and haptics to just change the way that we literally deliver healthcare in the most direct way possible. And today, I am pleased to kick off another co-presented event. So we have some reps with us, or one in particular that I'm staring at, Monica, from the SEGD. So that's the Society for Experiential Graphic Design, that's helped us kind of co-curate an event that's going to look at the future of navigation and all the amazing things that are happening in the space of multi-sensory wayfinding and design. So before I kick it over to a few of our panelists, which for the sake of efficiency, I will invite you to introduce yourselves as you come up. I first wanted to invite Monica up just to say a few words on what the SEGD is all about.
Sure, thanks. I'll be quick because the speakers are more interesting than I am. But as Garrick said, we are the Society for Experiential Graphic Designers. Global organization. We have chapters in cities all over North America, Europe, Asia, and Australia. I'm co-chair of our local Toronto chapter. SEGD is a group of multidisciplinary designers who build experiences that connect people to place. We collaborate with a number of associations and organizations like KITE Creates to kind of, push the design for our human users and, make our environments engaging and intuitive and accessible for all. So really happy to be here today. This is a really interesting topic and looking forward to hearing about it. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Monica. And as I invite our first speaker, James March from Sheridan, to march your way up here to the podium. I'm sure that's not the first time you heard that dad joke. I will note, just an administrative point, for our friends online, we are using Menti to collect questions. So we'll be monitoring this and we'll do our best to kind of incorporate questions that come up live. For those that need the assistance, the Menti code is 6738. 6767, and this will be visible in presentation materials throughout the day. And of course, for our friends in the audience, we'll have live mics, so feel free just to kind of weigh in with your questions live. So without any further ado, James, please welcome, kick us off for today's discussion.
Oh, cool. Thanks, Garrett. Pleased to be the opening band. And I'm James. I'm a 5'7" male. Is that short king something? I don't know. All right. Wow, this thing is awesome. Okay. Look at this. Oh. Should I do this? I will say this just before we get started, the land acknowledgement, that we do acknowledge that the events and meetings we host take place on land traditionally inhabited and cared for by First Nations. Toronto is the traditional territory of many First Nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, and the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. Okay, so today I'm going to kind of be the broad strokes, broad perspective on multisensory navigation, and then we'll bring Leah up to discuss our future plans for research in this area. So multisensory wayfinding integrates multiple senses beyond sight, right? So touch, sound, and even smell to guide people through spaces. And importantly for us, this approach is particularly useful in environments that need to be more accessible and immersive. So there's a whole variety of examples that I'm sure many of you, are relatively familiar with. Things like tactile paving, braille signage, and sound beacons are fairly regularly used in major cities for folks with visual impairments to navigate through the world. Projected light paths and floor textures, small delineations between them are a way to distinguish certain sections of a room or buildings. Sound and spatial navigation, things like directional sound beacons used in some public spaces, and even have ultrasonic or directional speakers to emit sound cues, are ways in which you can guide through and towards things like exits, information desks, and key locations. And there's also musical and thematic audio paths. Typically, you'll see that in things like theme parks and the like, where gradually changing music can guide guests towards different zones. Interactive and haptic wayfinding. So there's, things like vibrating wearables and Bluetooth beacons that can be used to, direct someone to the left with 2 taps and to the right with 1 tap. Heat responsive pathways and directional airflow, so using the haptic responses and things like temperature and wind directional to signal movement towards exits and open areas are an area as well. A new and kind of, I'm sure, budding area is augmented reality wayfinding. So currently that exists in a mobile phone app, possibly. However, in future years, we're seeing this technology, kind of land in something that would resemble a lot of the glasses we wear, and this type of thing where you could have overlays of arrows, landmarks, and real world views could be a way to sort of use this kind of technology to navigate further. Proximity-based alerts, so things like smartphone vibrations that can notify users as they approach key locations is another example. But in particular for us today, particularly myself and Leo, our sort of area of key interest here is going to be scent-based wayfinding. So scent zoning is this kind of area of interest we're going to look into in our research, where different scents are used to subtly differentiate spaces. So if you can think of things like lavender or more calming scents for relaxation zones, certain citrus scents create alertness, and so they could be used in certain areas as well. Some airports and malls use these to make areas more recognizable. There's also directional airflow and scents. So things like casinos and theme parks sometimes use scent diffusers with airflow patterns to subconsciously lead guests towards key attractions or exits as well. So, little short story about myself. When I was 3 years old, I undergone a traumatic eye injury, so which made me blind in my left eye permanently. And from the age of 3 to about 7 or 8, in order to kind of maintain, strength in my eye muscles, I had to use an eye patch for pretty much the vast majority of those years. And so one of the things that my mother, who's a nurse, sort of set up around the house was effectively this kind of scent zoning thing where certain areas of the house, had different essential oils basically to help me navigate around. Of course, there was barricades for stairs and stuff, but more or less on the floors that I was in. That's kind of how I navigated around. Not knowing for a while that I had a greater affinity for scent, I later, in 2019, studied perfumery composition at ISIPCA in Versailles and Grasse, France, and that kind of led to further interest in how that can integrate into design, and now part of it is being taught in a program at Sheridan College, our honors Bachelor of Experiential Design, in which we have courses called Multisensory Experiences and Wayfinding, among others. Oh, and so a few things on smell and memory, just kind of, again, this is sort of the broad view, and then we're going to get more specific over time. So smell, what's interesting about it as a kind of multi-sensory, a tool for memory, a tool for navigation, is that it can take a direct route to the limbic system, right? So things like emotion or memory can be triggered fairly rapidly with smell. It's often also linked to implicit memories. So unconscious memories, meaning you might not actively try to recall a memory. It simply resurfaces when you encounter a familiar scent. And I'm sure many of you can relate to that. A lot of us, a lot of myself and students talk about, banana medicine before even saying what it is, and all having kind of like this shared knowing of what it is. Unlike audio and visual memories, which can fade or be distorted by other cognitive processes, olfactory memories are highly resistant to forgetting. And so as a result, for example, an early loss of this can be a sign of neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. Using scents can enhance mood, reduce stress, or improve sleep. They can, be an arbiter of certain changes. Certain aromatherapies use smell to try to help individuals learn with dementia across and access old memories. And in particular as well, in our field, companies are beginning to use scent as almost like a marketing tool or a thing in retail more than ever. And so, it was one of the reasons why we integrated it into curriculum at that point. A few things about scent-based wayfinding as well, and some more about scent zoning. So you can approach it as distinct scent areas. Could be, a way to distinguish between lobbies or entryways or dining areas or rest areas, for example. You can also use it as a scent pathway, so to get you from one end of for example, a long room to another. And within that can be things like scent anchors. Emergency exits can also, be communicated with slightly stronger scent cues, something like lemongrass or something, for example. And importantly as well, it can act as a routine cue. So it can be something like, in a way to organize daily schedules, for example, if medicine needs to be taken at a certain time or something needs to be sort of triggered, a scent cue can act as that. A few broad overall insights from recent studies. The main thing I want to kind of go on with here is that there's cultural and demographic differences, of course, that shape odor perception. So the way this needs to work in many respects is that it needs to be context specific. It needs to work at an almost individual level, and that's where that fragrance industry has gone. We'll likely talk about that in the coming minutes, because depending on your background, you might have more an affinity for, spicy or woody smells. You might have a greater ability to distinguish between different types of woods, whereas others might not. And so it is very context specific. And for older adults, a scent-based wayfinding system then could focus on enhancing things like accessibility and providing a whole variety of supports, considering age-related changes in smell, perception, and memory. And with that, I'd like to bring up my colleague Leah to talk about our future research plans in the Center for Elder Research.
Thanks, James. And I bet the person who's wearing those goggles in that photo didn't know that they would be in the audience today, so shout out there. This is the correct slide. Okay. Yeah, thank you, though. Sorry, I'm a little bit shorter, so I'll lower that down for myself as well. Thank you, everyone, and thanks for having us over here at Garrick today. I'm Leah Tsotsos. I'm the director of the Center for Elder Research at Sheridan College. We're an applied research center that really focuses on doing high-quality applied work that will enhance healthy aging and all the contexts that support older adults, while also making sure that the outcomes of that work go back into the hands of people who can use them. And so in this context, some of that really relates directly to how are people designing things, how are people creating things and implementing them in spaces and contexts where older adults are living, working, thriving, or receiving care of various kinds. And I think the way that I really kind of fit into this and where the collaboration with James is going to be setting up is that we're able to bring the aging perspective to these questions of design and wayfinding and navigation. And so that's sort of what I'll be walking us through in the next couple of slides, just thinking about how does the aging experience or how do the demographic changes that are forthcoming in our society influence how we might be thinking about some of these questions, and how can you do the work that you're doing with all of these principles in mind and ultimately make sure that you've enhanced it well for all members of the population. So I do, because I'm a scientist, have to show you a few graphs. I'm practically contractually obligated, but really I just wanted to highlight, if you didn't know already that we have an aging society, let me tell you that we have one. You may not necessarily see it directly in your lines of work, and it may not be the target users or the clients with whom you're working most directly, but I can guarantee you that as we continue to go through the coming years and decades, we will be seeing this really great expansion and increase in the proportion of older adults in our society, and it's going to have really meaningful impacts on a lot of our industries and a lot of the ways that we do things. So the topic of wayfinding and creating spaces and considering how to optimize spaces where folks will be living and working becomes of really great importance when you consider how are older adults going to be aging in place? How will they be living within retirement or long-term care home settings? How will they be navigating hospitals or other medical centers? And I'm sure if I put a poll out here, many of you have probably assisted someone older, maybe older than the age of 60 or 65, to something related to a medical appointment. If you haven't yet, chances are very, very good that you will in the next couple of years as those demographics change. And so we're going to be having these multiple groups of folks who are needing to engage actively in all of these spaces, and that's where these principles start to really show their effect. One of the things that I like to highlight, though, is sort of kind of dissociating ourselves, though, from the notion that these changes that we may see with age are solely dependent on a chronological age number. So James outlined it really clearly, right? There's a lot of things that begin to decline as we age, and depending on the age that you are, you may already be noticing some of these things in yourself. Vision may change, physical fitness, physical capacity may change, cognitive speed may change. A lot of things just do that with age in an average sort of a way. Not pathological, yet they do. And that's what you can see in the blue line here, sort of, normal aging trajectory. As age increases on the bottom, there's a level of functional capacity. We start out relatively high in most of those domains, and as we age, that starts to decline in a gradual sort of a manner. Of course, that purple line, though, could represent an accelerated aging scenario where something may happen. You may have an accident, an illness, some kind of a thing occurs, and there may be a reason that your functional capacity decreases earlier than might be otherwise expected given your chronological age. And you have a different sort of a trajectory, and you may have different needs and requirements. Having said all that, though, Those two lines at the bottom, which represent frailty and disability, you could start at any level of functional capacity at any age. You might remain there for the duration of your life. You may start low and you may increase as a result of some sort of a treatment or therapy or something that occurs, again, in your life that changes your context. So what I'm trying to demonstrate here is that a lot of when we're thinking about how might these cues support an aging population, what we're ultimately doing is supporting the entire population. We're almost using age as a proxy to kind of look at a representative sample of a lot of different changes and things combine on average in older adults. And if we look at them as a large group, there's a couple of things that we can say on the whole. But really, it's not about age in and of itself. It's about considering what are those needs and requirements of the folks that you are designing for and building for and creating for, and then thinking about that in a much more nuanced sort of a way. So there's a couple of, sorry, let me just get all my things up here so folks online can read them as well. So there's a couple of things to sort of consider if we are looking at older adults as a particular demographic, though. James already mentioned olfactory sensitivity may decline, and so that could result in a differential ability to detect certain scents, react to certain scents. You may have heard of this anecdotally in people who don't realize that something is burning on a stove when they've stepped away, and that represents kind of a risk of living alone or living on their own. There's a lot of scent tied to memory and familiarity, and that certainly can aid and maybe will help, aid recall and reduce disorientation for folks. But there's also a really important part about safety and clarity, and I say sort of clarity of purpose. Why are we introducing scent as a wayfinding tool and a technique? Is it therapeutic? Is it instructional? Is it intentionally for reminiscent purposes because we are aiming for some kind of a clinical outcome? We can't just be throwing scent out there without a particular plan and someone kind of organizing it all up top, because if everything just starts smelling like a mixed up combination of lemongrass and citrus and lavender, folks are just going to be getting confused. So particularly when you're considering a group that may have other reduced abilities, whether they be cognitive or olfactory, why are we using this as a tool? Why are we applying this technique for this particular purpose? And how can we maximize its outcome? The cognitive change plays into this part as well, right? So we can promote recall and we can promote reminiscence, but we could also trigger other memories, which people may wish they didn't have to recall in the context of that. And how can you manage the emotional impact of some of that recall and some of that reminiscent experience? And so all of that I sort of bring up in the end when we consider where does ageism fit into how we're considering the role of older adults in wayfinding and navigation. So while we can make some generalizations about an older adult population and the kinds of changes that are occurring to their various senses and their abilities, we have to be really cautious not to assume that they are a homogeneous group, because they very much are not, right? So if we're thinking about how we're designing for older adults, and I know Nima and Lisa are going to do an excellent job showing how we're doing that in a very specific healthcare kind of a context, there's a lot that we can do to make these excellent designs. The reality is, though, that once we've done that, considering older adults as a target population, ultimately that's just a better design for pretty much everybody, right? And there's that element of, let's not fall into the trap of assuming that we've made it really, really well for whoever we think a stereotypical 76-year-old is. And really just take a step back and consider what's the impact of these approaches on folks of all ages and all abilities. As she tries to click her slide, there we go. So James mentioned that we're starting to set up a multisensory lab at Sheridan. So if you're ever in Oakville at our Trafalgar campus, open invitation, come on by. We're going to be looking at integrating a variety of different multisensory techniques and a variety of simulation applications as well. So that may include immersive experiences, but that will also include physical simulations like modeling tremor or modeling different visual conditions or various elements of modifying gait, manual dexterity with gloves, that sort of thing. So we're going to be setting up very much as both a teaching and learning and applied research space. What are the kinds of protocols that need to exist for a lab setting where students will be coming in and engaging with these learning tools? How can we workshop this? How can we embed this into curriculum so that we're training future grads to enter these design spaces already understanding and knowing how to implement all these principles? We're also going to do a whole bunch of pilot studies in research space. You know, how can you leverage wayfinding enhancement in multiple settings? Do we want to develop different kinds of fragrances for people? And maybe there's an element of personalization that can be achieved with the right sort of protocols that can be then therapeutic or used by individuals in sort of a direct-to-consumer kind of a way. And also, here's a little shout out that we're interested in community partnership and engagement, right? There's lots of people here who may have interest in these kinds of spaces. KITE Creates is doing a great job bringing everyone together, and I know there are many people at UHN and KITE broadly who may be online or in the room as well who are doing research related to a lot of these elements. I think we're always greater when we work together and we share our resources and the approaches that we're taking. So we're really explicitly trying to find some of those collaborative research opportunities where we can get lots of different kinds of folks coming into the lab and helping to inform our learning about all of these things. And so with that, thank you again for having us. Here's the ways that you can get in touch with James or with me about and learn more about what we do. And we're really happy to stick around after the panel chat and tell you a little bit more about our plans. Thanks.
Gonna try and figure out how to work the clicker. Oh, yeah. Hi, everyone. I'm Nima Gopalakrishnan, and I'm really excited to be part of this discussion today about talking to you all about the future of navigation. We've already heard quite a good amount of insights in terms of how scent can help, with wayfinding, and I'm excited to talk to you about how wayfinding and placemaking plays a role in multisensory navigation. So my background is in architecture and design. I've worked in architecture and design projects in India and in Singapore, and then now I'm doing wayfinding design in Canada. I still can't seem to figure out how to make this clicker work. Oh, there we go. I work for a company called Entro, and we are a experiential design firm, and we have experts in the field of art, design, architecture, and even neuroscience. And so we are a hive mind of strategists, thinkers, and believers. To give you a quick snapshot of the kind of work that we do something as small as design of a postage stamp to large-scale projects as airport. We also do some work in art and culture, where we do some interactive, interpretive work and exhibit design. We also do some strategy and planning for civic landscape spaces. We're also in the area of transportation and also healthcare. And so today, as I mentioned, we are going to be focusing on one aspect of the kind of work that we do, which is placemaking and wayfinding. And the project that we're going to be talking about is a project that is currently being developed for UHN. It is the Seniors Emergency Medicine Center at the Toronto Western Hospital. Now, this is a unique project because this is one of Canada's first purpose-built emergency facility that's tailored to care for the unique needs of older adults. It aims to achieve a new standard for geriatric emergency care in Canada. So the design focuses on creating a safe and supportive environment for older adults, particularly keeping in mind that they have some complex and specific needs that we need to address. The design also focuses on specialized lighting, non-slip floors, and an intuitive wayfinding and signage program that helps people feel like they are safe in the environment that they're getting care for. We all know that the built environment is a complex space, especially in healthcare. There's a lot of anxiety and stress that we feel when we're in a healthcare environment. We also know that well-designed spaces and human-centered spaces can help rejuvenate patients and visitors and also the staff who actually work there to care for the patients. We also know that these well-designed spaces can lead to better patient health outcomes and overall satisfaction. So when we think about older adults especially, their needs are a little bit more complex, and the design has to basically cater for that specific need. And we also know that in a typical emergency environment, older adults are likely to face more unfavorable effects. And so the negative outcomes of those effects can also lead to their time after being discharged from emergency. And so the work that we do here, as I mentioned, focusing primarily on wayfinding and placemaking. So what do I mean by wayfinding, right? It's something as simple as does what it says on the tin. It's navigating, helping people navigate through complex spaces. Placemaking, on the other hand, is trying to create a connection with the spaces that you are trying to navigate. It's an attempt to make these spaces more accessible, more inclusive and welcoming, and also try and help people move through these spaces through soft, subtle sensory cues. Spatial awareness plays a very crucial role in multisensory navigation. It is sort of deeply connected with how we interpret, navigate, and interact with these spaces. So we've all been in situations in our lives where we feel like, we're in a maze. We're trying to navigate through a maze. And so as our cities grow, as our places grow, these complexities really only get more and more challenging. And so with wayfinding and placemaking, we aim to provide orientation and direction and confirmation of your arrival. And so by addressing some of these questions that you typically have, where am I going? How do I get there? Have I arrived at my place or my destination? That makes you feel safe in an environment. And so by providing that bird's eye view of that context that you're trying to navigate, you have a sense of safety and welcome that you feel. So you have a better chance of trying to get to the destination that you want to get to. Let's take a minute to look at this photograph for a second. This is a very well-intended design, right? We didn't want to interfere with nature, so we'll put a pathway around it. But what's interesting is, you cannot beat human nature. We always will find our shortest, most quickest pathway to our destination. And so we have to keep that in mind and design for it. So bridging that gap between the user, place, and purpose was a key goal in designing this experience for the SEM Center. And I will say SEM Center because that's the short sort of colloquial word that we've started using it, and I do mean the Seniors Emergency Medicine Center. And we also want to make sure that the interaction within the center feels very intuitive and meaningful for its users. And so with the wayfinding program, as mentioned, we create that sense of safety by providing context for where you are. And we also want to garner and foster connection between the user and the place. And that's where landmarking and placemaking sort of plays an important role in conveying the core values of what the center is planning to offer to its patients. We also, with success, hopefully the users will be able to engage and interact with the brand and the space in a much more meaningful way than you would otherwise. So when we set out to plan this experience, we typically approach it from a place of knowledge and expertise that we have, and understanding of what best practice solutions are out there. But we also approach it from a place of humility, empathy, and collaboration. So it's really key, especially for a center like this, which is setting a precedent for what design could be for future spaces that cater to our older adults. So we work very closely with architects and our consultants to understand and rationalize what the context of the space is. We consistently and constantly have our touch points with specialized specific groups within the UHN organization, because we also want to make sure that operationally we are taking care of all of the staff needs. So the wayfinding and the placemaking program can sort of respond to some of those needs as well. We also make sure that we target users and volunteers and family who use these spaces, and try and understand, hey, what is it that you feel like the current situation is lacking in terms of a wayfinding and a placemaking point? So while our design usually is a iterative process, it's not always linear. And so we make sure that with engaging with key people at the key times, we sort of go back and forth and provide recommendations and solutions that's actually meaningful ultimately for the end user. So while mapping the signage and the placemaking moments for this program, there were 3 key areas that we focused on. Considering the human factor, color and strategy, and what the placemaking strategy for the space would look like. So the human factor, focusing on mounting height. Now, UHN has its own fully established signage standards package. Any renovation or new build within the campus will use these signage programs to implement the new signage standard. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. And so what we looked at was there was a gap, right? Because right now the signage standards caters to the general population. It takes care of not necessarily only the aging adults, but a majority of the user group that will be accessing the hospital and the healthcare space. And so looking at the mounting height, we know that older population most likely are to have decreased peripheral vision. They also have a tendency to have a lowered gaze, sometimes because of physiological needs or could be because of pharmacological limitations. And so we wanted to adjust the mounting height of the signs within the space to accommodate for that decreased peripheral view. But at the same time, there's also a challenge because a lot of the signs within the program also has tactile and braille components to it. So the standard for mounting these signs is within the range of 60 to 48 inches from finished floor level, because that's really the reach distance for how somebody will be able to read the tactile and the braille elements. So in working with the architectural team, we were able to identify where the sweet spot was so the sign can be mounted lower. And so any of the wall protection and any other sort of equipment that you need, handrails and things that goes on in the space, does not compete with the sign. And so you have the space for the signs to live in that sort of an environment. We also looked at text size and message density particularly. We wanted to make sure that wayfinding instructions within the signage program were simple, clear, and less dense is the word. Typically, for any wayfinding signs, the range of the text height that we would use is 22 inches to 22 millimeters to 24 millimeters. But for this specific center, we increased it up to 30 millimeters where possible. And also not directing users to sub-destinations, but really just focusing on taking them to like the main primary destinations and then sort of giving it a berry-picking approach where you're giving the right information at the right time and so on and so forth. We also looked at color. Now, talking about color, we don't want to bring in too much color and contrast into the signage program. We want the signage to be available for somebody who needs it, but we also want it at the same time to disappear when it's not required, because we don't want to contribute to the visual overload of what you typically will end up seeing in a hospital environment. Emergency departments are typically identified in red, but for this center, we said that we will not use red because, again, red is, it creates a sense of alarm, and so we wanted to move away from red and stick to a dark neutral gray. And so we moved away from patterns, bright colors, and dark gray for the signage program. However, for the interior space, we wanted to play up the color that that's being applied to sort of give more character to the space. So we know that blue, green, and yellow are associated with calm and positive feelings because of its associations with nature. And so the interior color palette was defined, and I know I want to caveat that this is not the most up-to-date. There's been some edits and changes to this since when this image was produced. And so we landed on the 3 color palettes here, which is like the yellow, green, and orange. As this is still a project that's currently underway, we only have renders and we don't have images to showcase, but I think this does a very good job of demonstrating how colors will be applied within the space. So basically to use these three colors to zone and organize specific spaces within the center so people can understand what context they're in within the center. And you see the orange wall there around the care center. And then the intersection of the blue and the yellow. And so now we have a baseline orientation where we use color to segregate these zones. The next thing that we thought about was how can we bring in some kind of an additional visual cue that will supplement color, because not always, we cannot always rely on color because not everyone understands and sees color the same way. And so we want to be mindful of using color and supplement it with some kind of a visual cue as well. And while thinking about these visual cues and graphics, how can we introduce something that brings in an element of surprise, delight, and also potentially try and engage users so there's that little bit of a break from typically everything else that you will see in a hospital environment. And so we started off with a macro to a micro approach. So the macro really being the themes of the color. How can we supplement that color theme with some kind of a visual graphic theme that sort of resonates with the color? And how can we bring that graphical image all the way down to possibly the actual patient rooms or the exam rooms that they're going to be in, because that's ultimately the final destination for the patient or the family. And so we thought about using some kind of an Easter egg approach in the graphic and the landmark icons. And I also want to caveat that this is still very much a work in progress, so the examples that you're going to be seeing are still partway through the process, and we're very excited to see what the outcome of this will look like. So to give you an example, this is the floor layout of the SEM Center, where highlighted in colors are the primary exam rooms where the patients will be at. And so we have a green zone, we have a yellow zone, and an orange zone. So we wanted to also verbally add some kind of a graphical pattern to it. So we thought about, could orange be a leaf? Could green be a plant? Could yellow be a flower? And we arrived at this through intense sort of engagement process with the clinical staff and also patients and volunteers and users who actually use the space. We started off with something a little bit more intricate, more detail-oriented. We engaged with them last November, gave them some multiple options, and we very clearly heard that they wanted something that's very simple, very easily understandable, yet something really nice to look at. And so the simplicity in the graphic approach. To give you an example of what the intended application of these graphics would look like, to look at this one zone as an example. So the green zone, which could be a plant zone, has 5 exam rooms associated with it. What you see in orange there will be the primary landmark graphic. Again, this is just an example, a render to demonstrate the idea. This is not the final. And so the landmark graphic, is a lily pond, say, with lilies and leaves. The exam room is the graphic that we extend into from that main sort of landmark graphic. So in this case, the landmark graphic will be divided into 5 sections. One section will be a focus of exam room 1, say. The second section will be a focus of exam room 2. So that way there's connection between the main landmark graphic and the exam room. This is another render of showing how that landmark graphic will then be applied inside the exam room. Again, work in progress, so the graphics don't relate because we're still working through with the user groups to figure out what the final visual will look like. And then ultimately, further dividing the exam room graphic into a more defined focused area of the graphic that will then further trigger memory of the kind of room that you were in. Now, with the simplistic approach for the graphics, we are limited in terms of how much we can layer the details of that one particular graphic, and so that's when you sort of start relying on the room number as well to supplement that visual component. So you're not just relying on color, you're not just relying on the graphic. There's also a simplified version of the room number, because typically in a hospital environment, room numbers can range anywhere between 4 digits to 6 digits, if not more, right? So we intentionally made sure that the room numbers are simple, and we have about 16, I want to say, 15 room numbers, and so that's also easily memorable and not overloading the users with too much information. And so in a sense, we're trying to enhance clarity and comprehension through the signage program and the wayfinding. We want to reduce anxiety and the cognitive overload. We also want to provide emotional support and comfort, because while you're sitting there waiting for long periods of time, it's always nice to see something that's subliminally making you feel, give you a sense of safety and comfort, rather than having to see some kind of an information or a blank wall. We also want to promote independence, because you are providing these layered approaches with the wayfinding, where you're not just reliant on text and numbers. Now you have color and you have graphics as well. And I'm really excited to see how one day scent will sort of play into this approach, because again, the simplicity of leaf, flower, and plant or vegetable, possibly there's scent that can help remind you of the area and the zone that you're in. I also want to sort of share very quickly about light playing a role in the way you feel within these spaces. And I will invite Lisa to join us later in the panel discussion as well, to discuss more how the interior design and wayfinding intersects, and how acoustics, lighting, and other accessibility and ergonomic considerations were made in this space to define a holistic approach for the design solutions for this center. Lisa, do you want to come say a very quick intro?
Thanks. And I just want to add a little bit more in terms of why we chose where we put the graphics on the footwall of the patient bedrooms. Sorry, not patient bedroom, the treatment rooms. I keep saying that, they're treatment rooms. In senior population that will be attending the SEM, they will be potentially coming with the most complex medical issues, and will take quite a while to treat, diagnose and treat. So they will be here a fairly long time. And so you're not expected to be in and out in 3 hours, let's say. It might be 11 hours or whatever. So there is then a risk that as you're staying here for a longer duration, you may end up with delirium. So one of the reasons for introducing the graphic at the footwall was to help ground individuals in their place and time. And as well, you can see large clocks that tell the time as it passes, and just a reminder of who, what day it is, who you're with, et cetera, all in trying to help ward off delirium. So when I first introduced the importance of these graphics, I said they're not pretty pictures on the wall. They're this is an architect, please, I apologize to the clinicians in the room. I said they're almost a clinical tool, because they're there, and that's why it's important that we actually study to a great depth, what does that image do to somebody? Because it will do something to somebody, and we need to make sure it's doing the right thing. And so that's what partially launched the need for this greater study to speak with seniors, et cetera, because I can pick a pretty picture, but what if that, causes, significant harm in some fashion? And that was what we wanted to make sure we weren't doing. So that was one of the key introductions and the reason for going into this deeper. And if you think about, just giving an example, let's say you go to the washroom on an airplane, your seat's halfway down the middle, and you keep walking and walking and walking, and you're like, which seat was I in? That's what I wanted to avoid as a patient in this. You go out to the washroom, and then you realize, I don't know where I was. Where do I go? How do I get back? So, even just, okay, so I was in one of the 5 rooms on the green wall. Okay, so I've narrowed it down to 5 rooms. So it was layering on of information. How do I find my way back? Or how do I find, all of these things, endless corridors where all the doors look the same is exactly the opposite of what we were looking for here. Just one of the sort of very unique things that's unrelated to placing is we've introduced tunable white light in this facility, and it's pretty unique for UHN. Tunable white light means that the lights throughout the day will be programmed to sort of follow the color temperature of the light outside. So it might be a little bit warmer in the morning, it'll get quite blue and bright during the day. In the late afternoon, it'll start to get warmer, if you can just pop to the next one, and then it'll start automatically dimming down. So that's going to happen in the corridors, and that's going to happen in the treatment rooms as well. And that's to help maintain people's circadian rhythm, and to help promote, better rest, recovery, and to, again, to avoid delirium. So that's sort of a unique thing here. So we also considered that, the color temperature of your lights make colors on the wall look very different too. So that was a factor in the yellow, orange, and green, and why we dropped the blue, because seniors don't see blue very well. It just looks gray. So that was another reason why we gravitated to those. And they're not set yet. We're going to be painting large swaths in the construction, and they're going to be testing them in place to see whether they work. Again, everything is being tested to see if it actually works. We can just design it and say, it'll be great, but is it? And that's the level that this project has gone to actually validate whether these ideas are going to work and to fix it before we get it built.
And the most interesting thing was, we have a tendency to always start grand, as you mentioned.
Yeah.
So when we started off with layering approach with graphics onto color, so when you think about green, yellow, and orange, we thought seasons, spring, summer, fall, and let's make it more context specific. So it's memories and landmarks from, the city. And so we went really deep and intricate into how we can layer this approach. But then once we started engaging with the users, we very clearly right away heard that that's too complex. We don't want anything that complex. If I've lived in Scarborough all my life, I have no idea what's happening in, the West End, High Park, say, And so it was really interesting to sort of hear from them, how a simplistic approach with a lot of intent and a lot of meaning, is the right way to go. And to Lisa's point, this is still a very much work in progress.
Yeah.
Once it's executed, it may not even resemble any of, hopefully not, of what we're showing right now, but we're excited to see where this will go.
Clinicians said as soon as somebody arrives, we start to ask them if they know what season it is, so that they can actually determine their cognitive function. So putting them in the fall room, in the autumn room, is going to be very confusing. Hence, we dropped that approach. Mm-hmm. So now it's just a color. So there was lots of learning. It's great. It's constantly learning.
Great. I think that ends our presentation, and
So I'll invite our panelists to sort of ease your way up to the front here. We're going to transition to more of a fireside chat style. Slide with the Menti code, just to engage our friends online. Yep, come on up, don't be shy. We're going to share these two mics. And Akash in the back there, wave, make yourself known. We'll have an additional mic for folks who might have questions in the room. So, as we transition, I think there was just so much information to absorb. I'm still absorbing. One, I want to acknowledge just like this is a exercise in collective and community learning. So I really appreciate how open, transparent you've been in actually sharing your process, showing your work, and also respectfully for the audience to understand that this is all work in progress, right? So things may change, and this is just part of us, having this kind of group learning experience. James, first, the breadth of just approaches that are available to us, right? Whether they're in field or being researched, amazing, right? The diversity of multisensory approaches, I think that was a wonderful survey. Leah, anything we can do to bring this community into your multisensory lab and all those aspirations to tie academic learning, clinical research and validation, let's keep that conversation going. What really stuck with me was the kind of framing that you introduced around the more nuanced approach to functional capacity, right, versus that just broad stroke aging. And that really hits home for us here, right? So KITE, we focus on healthcare innovation. Aging, of course, is a huge part of our mandate, but we look at illness and injury recovery, and we're situated inside an active hospital. This is Toronto Rehab, if folks haven't noticed, as you were trying to wayfind your way up to this auditorium. And we see that every day, right? Folks that have various ages and contexts that are dealing with temporary to permanent or near permanent, right? Changes in functional capacity. So that was just a really interesting way to frame that. And then, of course, Nima and Lisa, who joined us, and I do want to offer a space for you to properly introduce yourself, a principal at Cumulus Architects, in a moment.
Thank you very much.
Just setting the stage for that, and I think showing us, peeling the curtain back on how we go from design, right, to concept to implementation. So I know there's a mix of industry folks here, a lot of folks that may be designing or running their own buildings or sites, a lot of design expertise here. So maybe I'll open this panel, because I think that's where we kind of ended, by drawing that line between, how do we go from science of what works to concepts, right, to implementation, and how are you finding this specific theme of multisensory, which to me feels a little frontier, right? Like I'm going to go out on a limb and say it's not necessarily the end client that's asking you to do X, Y, Z, right? They're looking for ideas, looking for guidance. So maybe talk us through whomever, but I'm kind of looking at Lisa and Nima, that kind of relationship with the end user in terms of introducing and getting buy-in to even look at some of these more innovative approaches. Lisa, why don't we start with you, and maybe a bit more context on Cumulus and your role with the Myrna Daniels Senior Emergency Medicine Center, which, just for clarity, has not been built yet, right? I understand
No,
it's up for tender, right?
Currently,
Yeah.
it's currently under construction. No, it is.
Or it is?
It is
Yes,
under construction.
under construction, but not
I don't know
complete.
if it's visibly under construction, but we are reviewing shop drawings in my office, and so I do just want to, again, the project is all thanks to Myrna Daniels, who donated a very generous gift in pursuit of that. And, I've been working very closely with the various staff and whatnot that work there, and this was very much a clinically led project. My understanding is, because, and this of course doesn't show up to me because I come to the party late. They brought this forward. They saw the need for this, they asked for this, and they made it happen. And so there's been this is probably one of the most unique projects that I work a lot for UHN, and one of the most unique projects in the willingness to try out everything, to test it, to use science, use evidence-based design. Toronto Western has a collection of 5 colors of paint that I'm normally allowed to pick from, and 2 types of flooring. But I was told, if it's best for the project, carte blanche. So we even used the KITE ramp lab to test flooring. UHN doesn't currently use rubber flooring, but they were interested. If that seems to be the best, then we would go for it. So we also looked at cushioning floor over at Mount Sinai. They've introduced this great flooring. We looked at all sorts of things, but we're only going with what's best for project, what kind of resulted through testing it. And so either in that case it was scientifically testing it, or using seniors to weigh in on the project. And that is always what we say we'd like to do, but it doesn't always happen in design. And there was a senior caregiver in every single one of the user group meetings, making decisions about absolutely everything, all the way through the design. And so that was really important, and that was very useful.
Yeah, that the kind of engagement of people with lived experience definitely jumps out. And I'm not sure if you've physically met. I'm just calling out that our senior scientist, Sophia Lee, who is in charge of that ramp study, is in the room. So just making that connection. Yeah, and of course, only natural, being a research institute, that we engage all the best scientists and all the best methodologies. So it's also very encouraging to see how much of these concepts, as excited as we may be, right, in the design room and drafting table, the importance of actually testing and validating before they go into field.
And we went with all the floorings that she recommended.
Sophia's giving us the thumbs up. Did you want to jump in on that?
I can, certainly.
You look ready. You look
well,
ready.
I mean, I'm always ready to talk exciting things about aging research. But I think what you're saying, Lisa, is really one of the best things about this, is that this is the best way to do it, and it doesn't always happen. And isn't it wonderful when it actually is possible and is done, and people take those ideas that, Sophia will recommend the flooring because she has spent a lot of years studying this in a dedicated lab to study this topic. And hey, look at that, we're going with that flooring, right? That process, seemingly simple, does not always translate into reality for a variety of different reasons. We work with a lot of SMEs who are developing products. There, you encounter barriers, you encounter limitations, whether they're respect to funding, analytic capability, staffing issues. Sometimes you have to make decisions about what you can and cannot implement in real life. And I think it's really gratifying to see that you have the opportunity here to not only dive deep into the testing, but then to implement the winning solution and do it in a way that is at the service of the people who will be making the most use of that future facility. So I kind of love that. It's an ethos that we believe in at our center as well, that that's the best way to approach it, and to the best of our ability in all of our research studies, we try to do the exact same thing.
And I think what we do is a little bit tricky because design is very subjective, right? And so the way we approach it is really, with humility and empathy, and really hearing and listening to, what the users have to say. Because ultimately, we're designing the space for the users. They are going to be living in it. They're going to be using it, be it staff, patients, visitors, and family. And so I think, with a lot of that research and a lot of that analysis, bringing in a lot of what we've learned from past projects, we are able to sort of define solutions that ultimately, so far, it's been very positive in the way that we've been moving forward with the users. And it's a very good lesson in sort of learning to remove your ego from your design process and really making sure that, remembering who you're designing it for and what the process needs to be.
That's a great course title for all the students. How to remove your ego from the design process. I'm scanning, so please, if you have questions, just raise your hand. Oh, okay, where's our friend Akash? Okay, so we have some questions in the room. While Akash works his way around, I will bring our friends on Menti into the conversation. So a lot of fascination around the scent kind of work that was presented. So, or Mike, it goes straight to James. So I'll ask a couple here because I think they're kind of related. So one is, fascinating, thank you. Two, for retrofitting spaces. This is a question about kind of bringing in where it didn't exist originally. Are there any challenges that have been identified with existing scents associated with the environment? And I'll add to that approaches to managing that. Is that being a conversation, or is this something that we're going to test in our multi-sensory lab?
It's all going to be kind of part of the lab process, but I would say, with any scent, the mechanics of it surround, one is sensitivities. So certain chemicals, generally, folks are more sensitive to. Another thing is sillage. So that's what that is, or sillage, which is how much a scent projects, right? So if it's something that's only like half a meter, that is a sort of variable as well that we'll probably look into. But also how it interacts with, other scents that currently exist in the environment, and how it can either blend in or, kind of become like the primary profile. I don't have like a great answer to that because it kind of depends on like what the scent is and how strong that would be.
I feel like some of the work, if I recall correctly, is actually developing those protocols to analyze and have a structured conversation.
Yeah.
You kind of anticipated and answered another question that came around sensitivities and allergies. I don't know if you wanted to expand on that, but there was a question from the audience around that as well.
Well, like that certainly is a factor. I mean, like almost every time I mention even kind of being interested in scent research, there's always, 1 out of 10 people is like, oh, I don't like perfumes. I don't like the smell. I don't wear them. I work in a scent-free environment. How does that work? And those are incredibly valid concerns and all that. My invitation is to think of that, too much of a good thing is a thing as well, right? High volume sound can be just as piercing as like a high intensity scent. And so there is a way to sort of integrate scents in a way where, and fragrances in a way where it, you know, wouldn't be an issue for the vast majority of folks. And there's also like a potential for it to exist only in certain areas where and when it could be present. Like in France, where I studied, there was some of these aspects in the buildings that I temporarily studied in, and set at certain dilutions and the like. It's almost barely noticeable, but it's there. I mean, even for example, my condo building has like a, I guess it's kind of like this diffuser. It's almost like a diffuser that's vertically mounted that sprays a scent every once in a while. And I mean, the way that you construct it as well is, if you build something out that is more of a spray rather than something that's more highly concentrated, that will be a volatile fragrance. And what is meant by that is that it will disintegrate pretty quickly. Like even those who are allergic to it or whatever, or would have a sensitivity, I should say, to the fragrance. I mean, that would pretty much disintegrate so quickly that it wouldn't readily affect anyone in a negative way. Yeah.
Thanks for unpacking that and teaching us more words that we'll need to Google. So I see we have a question from the crowd. Feel free, if you'd like, to introduce yourself and ask your question of the panel.
Hi, my name is Cynthia Marshall. I am founder of Artelix, wayfinding consultancy here in Toronto. We do a lot of healthcare projects, but recently I was invited to, as a guest lecturer, to speak a little bit about different type of sensory, how they affect wayfinding. And for scent, I feel like for museums and environments like that, where you can opt in to kind of, I want to know what the ocean smells like, so you opt in for that. But in an environment where you have in a healthcare facility, I feel like James probably partially answered that. Like, how do you thread that sensitivity between what people cannot choose to have versus you're kind of just like injecting that to the environment. So that's question number one. Question number two is there a regulation that is being developed in terms of how intense is too intense?
Should I answer? Well, thank you, and nice to see you. Yeah. I'm, as I said, I have very little peripheral vision here, so I really have to turn this way. But okay, so the first thing is, I mean, I should mention that like our research isn't necessarily going to translate into necessarily healthcare facilities, unless I'm completely off course.
That's probably a few steps down the road.
Few steps down the road. So it will be a long road to sort of seeing even the viability of it. But maybe one thing that I want to say is that there is a lot of variation that we can test and experiment with to see how that viability could exist, for navigation. And it's going to be probably a long road to get there. But there's also these interesting technologies now. It's almost like think of it like a series of diffuser capsules that have a very small, very diluted little fragrance profile. I feel like there's something there where it can be more, even in a customized capacity, so it could speak to kind of what you mentioned as well, where it's maybe not, it maybe doesn't exist as, a bunch of fragrances dropping almost like down like rain, but it could be at a more localized level or individualized level. And now I'm forgetting your second point because the regulation part.
I don't know. I don't know if there are regulations. I was going to just chime in though that I think an equal and sort of opposite perspective on it is that there are some cases where you would explicitly not want any sense to interfere with a clinician's ability to use their sense of smell as a diagnostic tool, right? Think of lots of folks, what is a clue for continence? Smell, right? And so there are a lot of cases where I think you would explicitly want to avoid the use of those smells so as not to reduce one's sensitivity to be able to use the cues that may already be present for really important reasons. And so, it's kind of, as Lisa was alluding to, it's like kind of integrating all of those bits and what are the layers that we're adding. Where and when might a scent cue be something useful, helpful? Like throwing out a diffuser in front of the dining room is probably not helpful because it's just going to be constantly overpowered by whatever lunch happens to be that day. But if it's in a place where you shouldn't go or you want to create it's in the workout room and you want to energize people because they're entering into a space where you're hoping that they can challenge themselves and that's a whole different context. So I think there's an equal opposite nuance to it too. Is like we have to find out what doesn't work and where so that we don't do it explicitly. But I have no idea about regulations. That's not my jam.
On that, I see some KITE scientists in the room, so this is your 20-second warning that I might be calling on you. Pre-regulation, right? There's things like guidelines, right? Protocols that could be developed. This is very much the sweet spot of institute like KITE, and it seems like where Center for Elder Research is headed as well. So I think there's probably a lot of just real-time development of this and figuring out what questions to ask. So excellent example, and then how to go about researching and answering that. So I'm not sure if there's any. It doesn't have to be KITE scientists, but anyone in the room with maybe some research or clinical perspective that want to chime in. I know, Sophia, it's been mentioned in the past that other applications of, and sometimes accidental observations maybe, of smell in relation to motion sickness or things like that, which we might not think of, right? Because we're encountering it as consumers at malls, right, in our condominiums, but there's some surgical, excuse the pun, sort of applications where smell is a factor. I don't know if you'd like to comment on that. If you like, I will gladly pass the mic.
Thanks for cueing me. And thanks, Lisa, for actually supported the research. And I'm really, really, really happy to hear that the evidence from the research actually could be very, very helpful. And that's definitely some of the results we want to see. And in terms of the scent, I think actually, I am the vice chair for our current federal model standard for built environment accessibility standard, a long name. And the scent actually did come up in terms of the new federal standard for accessibility. Sadly, all I can tell is very limited because the whole committee actually is scratching the head, is like, what are the evidence and what research has to be done in this in terms of either using the scent as the cue for accessibility and how intense is intense and what is successful case, what is not successful case. So they're very limited. So I think what you are doing here, I think will be extremely helpful. So when those standard body trying to search for the evidence, hopefully in the near future, we can come up with some of the really solid evidence. And in terms of the scent used for other purpose, for example, I don't think our senior scientist, Behan, is here. So he is the expert in using the scent for actually minimize the motion sickness. So there could be some of the healthcare or sort of like medical benefits of using the scent. But again, we don't know enough. And in a public place, in a healthcare place, how should we use scent? So I think my sort of like relatively long answer is actually say we don't really have an answer.
We have to start the discovery process somewhere. I see another question in the room. Akash, if we can get that mic over to our friend near the front. There we go.
Thank you. Could we have the slide back up mentioning everybody's names and where they're from? And then
Yes, I'm not sure there was a collective slide, a catch for next time, but I'll try to ping the question as appropriate.
You mentioned multisensory. Did you
touch or texture? And I'll add to that because there was a question in Menti around sound as well. So feel free to respond to any or all of those.
No. We've done a little bit of work at the center related to auditory impacts of aging and how that may intersect particularly with cognition. So we've done a little bit of work of that space. Touch and tactile sense has come up a little bit in the context of reducing responsive behaviors or agitation in some individuals living with dementia, for example. So there's a body of literature that suggests that, you know, having something on your lap or something that you're able to touch may be a soothing kind of a practice. And so there's been a couple of contexts where we've looked at a little bit of work in those regards. I'm really hopeful that the new lab setting will allow us to dive a little bit deeper, but it's one of those things that, you know, people are so predominantly tend to think of vision and hearing as the most dominant senses, which in many cases they are. But I love the idea of engaging more haptically and considering how that extends to, you know, railings and bedding and, you know, the devices. When we're talking about devices in particular, we've worked with a lot of our student projects and companies that are designing apps and sort of mobile platforms about, you know, the haptic experience of doing this thing you want me to be doing on this particular device you want me to be doing it on. So it has come up in sort of little bits in a lot of different projects, never as one big deep dive on it, but I really want to. And so, yes, it's come up, but not in an intensive sort of a way, at least in our center yet.
Yeah, we deal a lot with the touch. And in a healthcare settings, you have to be careful because of IPAC reasons. It has to be easily cleanable. So we can't use anything too textured. But for example, like very, very minor cues, we're using a high contrast color for the handrail so that you can see it against the white wall. And so it has a mild texture to it. It's Acrovan, and it's fully designed to be cleaned. But on the returns next to the wall, they're stainless steel, so they'll feel slightly different. Yeah, and then, you know, we're testing out UHN is, and their clinical team, the beds, because, you know, seniors' skin is it tends to be much more thin and fragile. So they need a much deeper mattress, and it has to go very low, but it has to be very, very comfortable because the standard bed may not be suitable for somebody to lay in for any duration. So yeah, I mean, even on our care desk, we normally don't, I mean, it's way more expensive to do curved corners, but you'll notice every corner on that thing is curved and it's going to be tuned and whatnot, so that if anybody were to bump against it, it's less likely to injure. And so that was thought about at every micro level, wherever we could do it within the confines of an IPAC environment.
And I think from a wayfinding point of view, you know, the tactile and braille messaging on signage is really just the texture and the touch aspect of signs, but that's really a big gap, and, you know, may not be specific for this project, but that's something that we're constantly exploring and trying to push the boundary, because right now the requirements are that you have tactile and braille on your room ID, but that's your final point of your destination. What happens when someone arrives at the front entrance threshold of your building? How are they guided through, you know, various spaces before they arrive at their final destination? And so through some of the other work that we're doing, we're again engaging with users to try and understand how we can bridge that gap to bring in that tactile cue for users who will want to rely on it.
Is that a response to this? Okay, so Sophia, and then I'll just point out, Akash, there's a question in the back, one kind of in the middle, and but first I'll invite Sophia to unpack.
Sorry, I just have this urge really to say something about the tactile, because I think through today, multisensory, when we design the environment, actually we're designed for people with different needs. Sometimes actually they are competing. One of the good example is the tactile surface at the curb ramp. Those have like those bumps. They are designed for vision impaired people, but they are complained by people with mobility issues because they are not stable anymore. So in Japan, actually, they are exploring whether they can use different softness of the floor actually to indicate that is where you should crossing street instead of using the tactile. So by changing the surface texture for the textile. But that's not being researched enough. And for now, it seems like throughout the whole world, everyone just using the twist, which we know is not the best solution, but we keep using it. So there's a lot of things when we're looking at multisensory. We are designed for this whole population, but sometimes we are scratching our heads. How can we actually accommodate everyone?
So senior homes are taking them out because people with Parkinson's are falling. Get them, so where's the answer?
We are looking at it.
Well, every time I look at somebody in high heels and I go down the stairs, I think, I'm glad I got flats on.
In the back, I can't see the glare. Is that Varun? Is that you? Yeah.
Hi everyone, my name is Varun and I run Canada's leading accelerator for accessibility startups. You touched upon something, pun not intended. You touched upon something that I wanted to ask about, which is essentially navigating with vision loss and hearing loss. I had a chance to read a report that was put out recently around navigating with accessibility in mind, and you touched upon both the pros and cons of braille signage, but I was curious, what are some innovations or technologies that you're seeing in terms of accessible navigation for people with hearing loss or vision loss?
So I think at this time, digital is a space where a lot of technologies are being developed, but there's no standard there, right? It's really very personalized. For somebody who cannot, visually see that, we understand that there's quite a lot of apps and gadgets that are available, but that's through personal choice. Like, you are able to pick and choose what kind of gadget, for the lack of a better word, that you are subscribed to, and then that allows you to sort of help navigate these spaces. Now, where we come in is to try and bridge that gap between what are these platforms that users are able to use and how we provide some kind of a context and anchoring in the built environment. So the two sort of technologies are able to speak to each other. And that's, again, a constant learning and doing and understanding, because, again, as you know, digital is something that changes constantly. It's not, the static is unable to keep pace with the changes in the digital. And so I think the short answer to that is there is no one simple solution, but it's really just making sure that some fundamentals in the way we think about, wayfinding and how people make sense of space and how we clarify, the built environment to users and what cues we have available within the built environment that can then support these other avenues that people are able to sort of leverage to, make their navigation, day-to-day navigation simpler and easier.
In this, we also, we were very conscious of making everything acoustically absorbent wherever possible. Again, in the context of a hospital, it's very hard. You can't use carpet, et cetera. But initially we had some open bays. But if you're hard of hearing and your doctor's or your clinician is trying to speak to you and there's something going on in the hallway, whatever, it's like wah, 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 pretty much, right? So we actually changed the program in discussion with the clinical users to have every room has a sliding door so that you can close that door, so that if the clinician needs to speak louder to assist somebody to hear them, you're not then going to be, not everybody's going to hear your private information, And then the other thing is the care station, you'll notice that the front doesn't have any glass on it. UHN standard currently still, and preference through IPAC, is to include glass around the front. Well, we all know, I can't hear well enough through them. And again, if you put a speaker on it, then everybody hears your business. And then it creates noise in the environment. And we were trying to create a relatively quiet environment so that if I have to speak to somebody and they're hard of hearing, they can have a hope of hearing me. So, it's also just thinking about the environment, creating a quiet environment so that if you need to raise your voice, they're also going to be providing, headsets and speaker enhancements that people can wear as well. So, UHN does that well already, but also as an architect, we can help.
And with the new center, is there being consideration of machine noise or HVAC or that level of depth of analysis?
They are, looking at machine noise, and in fact, we were just discussing this in the context of an ICU. those machines make a lot of noise, and ideally that wouldn't happen. Whether the manufacturers have gotten there yet, they are going to be putting it in, in as a desire in their tender for equipment. But there's no paging in the room, for example. Like, we tried to take out as much noise as we could. But yeah, the manufacturers do need to get on board with that and, take out the noise as well.
Thank you for that perspective. I think there was a question in this area. The woman in white, Akash.
I have a question around, I guess, the development of a kind of universal language around some of these versioning things. So, I mean, the power of, visual wayfinding is like for watching time, like it's a universal kind of thing. So with scent, like, are people exploring, like, can we always signal an entryway with citrus? For haptics, is it always like, oh, if you're wearing something on your wrist, is it always two touches for the right and one touch for the left? Like, is there a kind of universal language that's being developed for these things? I know it's still early days, but I'm just super curious.
Thanks for the question. Not to my knowledge. Yeah, I think just the nature of that sense is that smell is largely intertwined with is very personal, and so as a result, to create a universal, smell for entryways or something like that. I'm not exactly sure how that would work, kind of cross-culturally or, yeah. Oh, yeah.
It's not exactly defining the framework, but I mean, a lot of us in the room might remember a thing called a floppy disk. Do we remember that? And at some point that came to represent save your work. Now that's kind of transitioning, and it's like a little cloud with an arrow, right? Because people don't know what floppy disks are anymore, right? So I feel like some of these, as they become more commonly used, those heuristics will establish themselves in a lot of those kinds of cases. So perhaps there isn't a universally accepted best practice yet. But, as soon as, everyone's earbuds also begin functioning as hearing aids, there will be some kinds of standard processes for how those operate, to what extent they suppress noise, to what extent they directionally amplify, or what have you. So in the same way that some of those heuristics have appeared for things that we're doing in other domains, like, I don't think anyone explicitly sort of announced to the world, like, push the floppy disk and that will save your work, or now push the thing and it's going to upload to the cloud. Like, nobody says that out loud, and yet now it's standard and all websites kind of look the same with a lot of those same navigations and all the documentation. So it may begin to happen the more that we do this work and the more that we talk about it and the more we publish our findings and our outcomes and the success stories of the open SEM, and look at how successful it was, right?
I'm curious, like, as a group like SCGD, Priyam, I see you, like, is that a role for industry organizations, like to associations to start to define that universal language? So if you had a follow-up, please, let's get our...
And us trying to, and you trying to ask more questions and me trying to follow up, it was around the same thing, like, is ADA doing anything?
Oh, perfect. Yeah. On the same wavelength. So are we aware of anything, whether it's through kind of industry association or, I don't know, Sophia, a standards body that either has asked or could be the adjudicating, I guess, right, body to define that? So I put that as a group question. So I put...
don't have the answer for those particular, like the haptic and the scent standards, but like SEGD does work with AODA and other accessibility organizations across Canada and the US to inform those standards, and we will publish white papers kind of updating everybody on what the new sort of strategies are.
And I can sort of speak to that. ADA has one of the strict standards in terms of what guidelines and rules you should follow for signage, right? although in Canada, we did have some guidelines for some older versions and iterations of AOTA in Ontario, but that's been, some of the newer versions have since been removed, and it really focuses on accessibility in terms of how you navigate and access spaces. And so a lot of the standardization, air quotes, that we talk about is really drawn from past projects and learning that we've done in working and engaging with users. We do rely on ADA standards to inform what the baseline is, and then we build on it. And so, going back to the point that, I forget your scientist's name. Sophia made in terms of gaps that there are, right? Like when you try to, when you enforce and you standardize something, then you're really not looking at it from a holistic point of view. And so at this time, it's really just doing, learning, engaging with people, understanding what works, and with anything new, to sort of reiterate what you mentioned, there is a learning curve. The more familiar we become with something, the more we understand it. And so, the goal really should be to make it as simple and intuitive as possible, so that learning curve is shortened. And so you very quickly understand what needs to be done, how you get to, synthesize that information for yourself and, figure out how to get to your destination, if that's what we're looking at.
I think we're hitting on one of these things. And Prima, I don't know if you had a related question. Next question to this gentleman, while he warms up. You're hitting on something that we struggle with in all spheres, right? This is innovation, things that are new, right? When you're dealing with hospitals, when we're dealing with major public works, there without judgment is a level of a culture of conservatism, right? And I don't want to get into a debate on that specifically, other than to ask the panel and maybe this audience, like, are there natural areas then that could be test beds, or that maybe you've seen as our test beds, where you can be more nimble, you can prototype, test faster without having to go through the layers of necessary kind of design, regulation, compliance that often holds back some of these innovative ideas as much as we may want to trial them in institutions like ours, right? So are there pockets of design practice or target areas that you've seen in the developer or built environment space that you think would be worth us looking at as a playground for an early playground for innovation?
Well, I mean, there are a lot of, and I know you've got the mic, so I'll keep it short, but there's a lot of national groups, the incubators, the, applied research networks, they, because of the nature of their collaboration and their funding and the sort of startup mentality, I think those are some of those places where that's beginning to happen, right? There's a lot of, bringing in new cohorts with people with ideas and testing them and validating them and then pushing them outwards. And so I think those are some of those places, and that includes KITE, that includes my center, that includes a lot of my other colleagues at Sheridan. There's lots of different places in, academic and design institutes where there are innovators and there are, playgrounds for that sort of thing. So I think there are lots of pockets everywhere. We just got to tell the story a little bit more. And yes, sorry, I know you're waiting.
Priyam, over to you.
Well, actually, it's might be a little bit accelerating that subject, but I work in virtual reality. I'm an industrial designer as well. I've been wayfinding too before, and right now I'm trying to find clues how to move people in VR. And so, but it's funny because all those things merge, right? And I was just going to ask you about simulation. Like, even in your creative process, like, do you use, like, bluntly, for example, that's not exactly my direct question, but would you use VR, for example, simulate those spaces, understanding the cues, like even the text, reading of the text, and all the patterns, the haptics, you name it, right? The sound, audio, and so you can already see that space, you can bring people in. I know VR is not exactly a abstract way of showing things to people, so that's also biased. You cannot have all the audience going through VR, but anyway.
I was actually just about to say, there's a couple different ways that we typically test things out into the previous question, which was, well, like, we often build mock-ups, or we have the contractor build mock-ups, but also on the SEM, one of the physicians at the SEM who is now currently in school for architecture as well. I don't know how she has time, but we shared our 3D model with her. And it's built, it's quite, I mean, the renderings you saw here came out of that 3D BIM model. We use Revit. So we are building it in Revit. We can do those little, and we do little simple vignettes during the user group process so people can see it. So she took our model and she actually created a VR environment. I didn't actually get the chance to experience it, but she just showed it to her to her colleagues and invited us to come 2 weeks ago, I want to say. So, and yes, I mean on big projects in particular, that often does get used because it's a really simple way to test things. It's more expensive to have them built. Like we built a prototype of even just the size of the room, the size of the treatment room. If I'm using a walker and then we're going to have a commode and we have the hand sink and we have a giant recliner and we have the stretcher, can we still move? Right off the bat. Or if we, it's as simple as, hey, we just put a sharp spin right there. Well, now the clinician can't actually get near the person's head. Even just like fine tuning, it could be big, it could be small, kind of things that come out of those.
And it's funny, you kind of hit on exactly a conversation that I was having with two of my colleagues just a couple of weeks ago. So I represent one of 5 research centers and hubs at Sheridan, and there's 2 others, one that's the Center for Applied AI and the Screen Industries Research and Training Center. We were just having a conversation about how we might leverage virtual reality and intelligent simulations to create responsive environments within which we can simulate something. So if you think about something like driving, right? Change the construction, how does that alter something? Throw in a bike lane, take out a bike lane. You simulate something, but the environment needs to be able to respond dynamically to the actions of the person experiencing the simulation. And how can we sort of meld, machine learning, AI, immersion, virtual reality, and sort of what you know about a target user, in our case, older adults? How can you create those simulation environments and do explicit testing exercises that can be intelligent and can evolve as you are learning and doing it? So you're on track, I would say. It's something that we've been talking about a lot in the last couple of months of how can you integrate across all of these technologies, and how is the patient going to respond? Like, you're reaching for the sharp spin, you nudge their bed, and they respond because you've created a virtual human character who can respond to the movement that was simulated in that environment, right? So it opens up, I think, a lot of possibilities where you could really model like, oh, like I really didn't move that person. This is a bad design choice. I should not put the sharp spin that close because this is what's actually going to happen.
Sure. If we just so folks online can hear us, just wait for the mic.
I've been in a couple of projects where it involved like a VR specialist, where the wayfinding signs get integrated into the architectural rendering, and then the client get to experience the space before actual, everything is being built. I think while we're talking about sensory stimulation, one of the interesting thing I find about that is because your brain expects the same kind of experience that you would have outside of the VR goggles. For example, you're seeing them being used for like roller coaster and things like that, right? And then now they're adding all of those, the wind and everything, to not make you lose your equilibrium, because people get really nauseous and sick after using them. So it's almost like, yes, that'll be great, but also maybe all of the other sensory parts should be part of that as well.
So, hold on.
I think this is very ongoing. I don't want to monopolize, the conversation, but there's a bunch of haptics, and like thinking even sense as well that allow you not to lose your, not to get nausea. I'm working on these subjects, and so I'm totally happy to, collaborate or whatever with people for that. But thank you for, actually pointing to that.
Keep your hand up for Akash. A time and energy check. This is amazing. I do want to preserve a bit of time for at least us in the room to maybe break and have formal networking. So I will signal we're nearing the end of our Q&A portion. But if you want to weigh in with your question.
Hi, I'm Bryce, and I'm a student at imagine, I don't know if scent would work outdoors, but if you're designing, say, a street signage system for like pedestrians or something, what are like some unique considerations for like outdoor environments, color?
Interesting question. Anyone on the panel want to comment?
Well, I mean, the first thing I think, I'm not a landscape architect, but I mean, I certainly work with them often enough. And they always consider, the texture of the ground. Like if you want to lead them to a sign, let's say, that they can then interact with and they're not visually, not able to visually see, the TTC does it. I wouldn't say necessarily well, but in your landscape, you can kind of suggest that somebody follow a path. I mean, the other thing would be to introduce scent plants. I mean, we do that in landscaping as well. From a therapeutic reason, a patient might go out and enjoy the smell of certain plants. And again, you could use that to direct people towards something that then would be tactile, that they could then experience as well. So, there's various different things in that respect that we do in healthcare gardens.
And I might sort of recall to all of us a couple of weeks ago when we had that snowstorm. There was a little bit of snow that fell on the ground, and you couldn't see parking lines, you couldn't see road lanes, you couldn't see fire hydrants. Whole signs got taken out, address things where they have a rock with the number of the place you're going to. So I think one of the considerations is don't forget how much the environment changes around whatever it is you're building out into the system, and how might you create redundancies in your navigational cues, right? So is it, in some parking lots, particularly downtown, like there's lines, so you look to see if there's a car there, but then there's also the lights above you, like it's red or it's green, and it shows you where there's that's a redundant cue, right? I can see if there's a car there or not, but I can also just look up above and there's a light telling me that there's a car there or not. So I would suggest that for outdoor things, recognizing the country we live in and the variability of our weather patterns, wherever you can build in multiple ways of giving people the same guidance, leveraging as many cues as you can, whether it's the scent, the lighting, the ground, the architectural lines, anything you can do, the more cues you can throw in to create that redundancy, I think the more effective it would be and more resistant to outdoor variability.
And also one key factor to consider when you're thinking about outdoor is what scale are we talking about? Because is it only pedestrian? Is it multimodal? Because vehicular, bicyclists, like everyone needs directions, right? So I think the scale sort of becomes larger, but I think fundamentally the principle remains the same. If you're using color, what kind of visual cues, how are you thinking about zoning? The way you would think about wayfinding within a downtown core of a space will be very different from how you think about it from a cityscape or a much larger scale, right? And so really understanding context and thinking about it from that lens will sort of help. Consent and everything else is not going to help you if you're sitting in a car and you're trying to figure out where to go and what your wayfinding cues are, right? And so sort of thinking about it in those layers and trying to understand where it's appropriate, how it makes sense, and then introducing it where it makes sense.
So sadly, I think it's time to move to our closing question for the panel. And I'm actually going to adapt, I think, the last question that came through Menti. So I'm going to ask each of you just to highlight what you think the main benefit of thoughtful wayfinding is. You could do more than one, but just to zero in on why it is that we're even having this conversation or considering these different ways. What is it that we're trying to achieve? Whomever.
I think fundamentally it creates a sense of belonging, right? Wayfinding, placemaking, everything else that we're trying to talk about is sort of making you feel safe and familiar in your environment. And I think that's really the added benefit.
Thank you.
I love that answer. And I'll pick up on the word that you used in the question, Garrick, of thoughtful wayfinding. I think putting thought into something that you're doing intrinsically brings a great deal of value to it. It not only achieves all the things that sort of Neem identified, but it also is taking into account a lot more about what you need to be doing if you're doing it thoughtfully versus not thoughtfully. So to me, the important part is the thoughtfulness of that exercise, that if you're doing it thoughtfully and conscientiously and intentionally with purpose, your outcomes will almost certainly be better every time.
My immediate reaction was stress reduction. There is nothing more anxiety-inducing than trying to get to, some doctors, some specialist you've been waiting for months to see, trying to navigate your way through the middle of the hospital, and you don't know if you're in the right spot. You got to stop people. You got to ask. So thoughtful wayfinding reduces stress.
And then the final thing for that to me is, because all these were great as well, so I'm the last. I got to top this. I would say probably reinforcement through, multimodal strategies. So which is sort of what we're talking about today. That ability to reinforce, navigation and wayfinding, through not just sight, not just sound, but adding, touch in certain cases, smell in certain cases, can just be really effective to promote safety, stress reduction, et cetera.
Wonderful. Can we have a closing round of applause for this amazing panel? What a journey. What a journey into this topic, a look into some breaking developments out of the UHN community. So really appreciate this panel and you all for choosing to spend time with us to join us in this conversation. Before we break for networking, power of the mic, I get to plug that if you are here at this event, you will be on our mailing list. So stay tuned if you enjoyed this event for additional events to come. We'll also shortly be announcing our second cohort. So we have a venture development program called Creator Circle. Varun has hinted at some great work that our friends at Access to Success have as well. So if you have a venture idea or early stage concept, I would love to see applications that hero multisensory. So stay tuned for news on when our cohort round 2 launches. With that, I'll bring a formal close. Thanks again to our supporters, the City of Toronto, FedDev Southern Ontario, for making events like this possible. And we'll close our live stream officially. So thank you, friends, for joining us online. And for the folks who are here, please, zero food waste policy. Eat up if not gone already, and enjoy the mingling with our panelists post-presentation. Thank you all.